Hi everyone. Hello. We will just wait a couple of minutes until everyone's joined us. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Martha, I'm Director of Foxglove. So pleased to see so many of you here. We'll just give it a second or two. Hi, Clive. Fantastic. Okay, I think we'll get started and people can join as we go along. So thanks so much to everybody for coming today. We're so pleased to see so many people here. My name is Martha. I'm a director of Foxglove. We are, for those of you who don't know us, a non-profit working to make the use of technology fair, both by government and big tech alike. And today we are very excited to be launching our campaign alongside 51 other organisations, many of whom are with us today. So hello to all of you guys and thank you for being part of it. So as you should already know, having signed up to the event, the campaign No Palantir in our NHS is about keeping Palantir, one of the most controversial tech and security companies in the world, out of our NHS. And you'll hear a lot more about who Palantir are today, so I won't give you too much detail. But in summary, they're a company with a terrible track record for helping governments, intelligence agencies and border forces to spy on citizens and target minority groups. And the coalition of 50 organisations that have come together as part of this campaign have done so because we believe that the NHS, and importantly NHS data, is a public asset that should be used for public good. And we're delighted that so many people are here to kick off the campaign. So thank you for being part of it. And you can read all about the campaign and see all of the organisations that are signed up to it on the campaign website, which is nopalantir.org.uk. And if you're on social media today for the launch event, we'd appreciate it if you could use the hashtags #NoPalantir and #DropPalantir. But as you'll quickly find out, the discussion we want to have today is much wider than just Palantir, and it's about the future of the NHS and NHS data. And as Cori's going to tell you in a minute, the future of the NHS is being written now, and sweeping changes are on the way that present both an opportunity and a risk. So from the Secretary of State's direction to centralised GP data, which Cori will talk about, and a huge rush through PPE contracts. So the speakers today are a mixture of doctors, health data experts, members of the coalition of the campaign, and we can't wait to hear what they have to say. And so I'll just briefly tell you who will be speaking today. So we're joined by Clive Lewis MP, a Labour MP for Norwich South and Vice Chair of the Coronavirus APPG, and Dr. Mike Galsworthy, Director of Scientists.
Recording in progress.
EU and March for Change, Gracie Bradley, Interim Executive Director of Liberty, my colleague and co-founder and director Cori Crider from Foxglove, and Dr. Julia Patterson from Every Doctor, who's also a signatory to the campaign. And sorry, I should have said Gracie is as well. And Katharine, Thane, Senior Advocacy Officer from Migrants Rights Network, who's also part of the campaign, and Dr. Kitty Worthing, Junior Doctor, and from Docs Not Cops. Thank you to all of you. We're really pleased that you're here. So throughout today, we're not just going to be talking at you, you'll be thrilled to know. There's an opportunity to ask questions throughout. So if you have any questions, you can use the chat function to message my colleague Tom. Hello, Tom. And Tom will make sure that your questions make it to the speakers. And we're also going to do some live polling. So we'll let you know when that happens, and we would love to hear your thoughts on some of the things that are being discussed. So first, over to you, Cori Crider, who's going to talk about Foxglove's work fighting Palantir with our partners Open Democracy and the fight for the future of our NHS.
Thanks, everyone. And it's really good to be here. I'm assuming everyone hear me okay? Yeah, great. So As you all know, following the news, the core problem that we have seen through this pandemic is that the government has been bouncing through problematic deal with problematic deal without anybody's consent. There have been lots of court cases about this. Every doctor's case is about PPE, for example. But basically, during the pandemic, rules for public contracting went out the window, and everybody from Matt Hancock's publican to Lex Greensill suddenly was able to siphon cash off of the NHS. Now, we at Foxglove noticed one deal with particular concern because one of the companies who saw this opening during the pandemic was Palantir. We saw that they were managing this thing called the COVID data store last March, which was the biggest single aggregation of confidential patient information in the NHS's history. And we were instantly worried because we knew who Palantir are. This is a company that we've known about for years because Palantir has spent its entire history supporting powerful state bodies, especially in the United States, but not only, to abuse powerless people. So we're talking about Los Angeles police's systems that look to predict and target offenders. We're talking about immigration and customs enforcement in the US. Those are the people responsible for the kids in cages at the US border. You probably have seen the pictures. Their program of deportations, things like special forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. Time and again, Palantir's tech has been used not to heal, but to harm. And we just thought, hang on a minute, what is this company doing in the health service? People in the UK have no idea who this company are or what they stand for. They probably don't realize that Peter Thiel, the chair, was a massive financial backer of Donald Trump's campaign, and even once wrote a paper saying that he no longer believes freedom and democracy are compatible. Are these the values that we really want in the heart of the health service? So anyway, Foxglove, we decided we had to do something about this, and we started to probing it and fighting it legally and to raise the alarm with people about what was going on. So last year, we took two legal cases about that data store deal that Palantir was part of with the news website Open Democracy. The first one was just about getting the contracts published so we could see exactly what was going on. And the government caved on that just as we were about to go to court, and they finally published the contracts. The second one, we really tried to stop Palantir using the pandemic as a beachhead to get a permanent role in the National Health Service. And again, we won concessions out of the government in that case as well, where the government, after we filed judicial review papers, basically said, look, we're not going to go beyond COVID purposes with this giant data lake without talking to people first. But we always knew this was the thin end of the wedge and Palantir would be back for more, and that installing themselves permanently in the health service was always the plan. We know it because documents show that they were lobbying the head of NHS England over watermelon cocktails as far back as 2019 and saying, we think we're the perfect partner for the health service. It's pretty clear, and they've made it clear, that they see government health services like ours as a pretty lucrative new source of funds. And they'd quite like, I think, the clout that comes with having a partnership in the NHS. And we also suspected, by the way, that this giant aggregation of data that happened at the beginning of the pandemic, this data store, that the government said was an emergency system and going to be disbanded at the end of the pandemic, was in fact going to be made permanent. And in a way, that last issue is just what has happened and is the news that we all need to be following now. So I don't know if you saw, but on the 12th of May, the health department bunged up a kind of government website. They didn't really put it out. They didn't publicize it much, but basically making an order to every GP in England to hand over the confidential health information of every man, woman, and child in England. If you're dialing in from Scotland, you can rest easy. But everybody on this call who is from England, you should know that you've been given by NHS Digital and Public Health England until the 23rd of June to opt out from having your entire health record potentially scraped and shared, going into this government data lake and maybe shared with third parties, including companies for commercial access. And NHS Digital haven't ruled out Palantir managing that data. They haven't said what companies will be able to access the data and on what terms. And so basically, we're now calling with other organizations like Just Treatment and others for a pause that keeps faith with patient trust. And that, we think, is really the kind of wider issue here. We've come together to talk about Palantir, a particularly bad example of what can go on if you don't think about patient trust in the health service. But actually, this question, the future of the public asset that is all of our health data in the NHS, that's a question for democratic debate. And so we're so glad that you're here. I'm going to drop a couple of links in the chat before I hand over. I'm going to drop in a guide put out by the organization Med Confidential about how you can opt out of the process. And I'm going to drop in one more link in the chat. I've already sent you the petition about Palantir, and we've got another one going because apparently two petitions going at once is just how we roll these days, which basically calls on the government to pause this giant grab of GP data and give people a meaningful chance to opt out. And with that, I will stop and hand over to the next person.
Thank you, Cori. Yeah, great. So we will make sure that that link is shared in the chat, and there's more coming on that this week. So before we go to Mike, who is our next speaker, we are going to launch a poll that hopefully is quite a simple one and should just pop up on your screens if the technology does what I'm told it does, asking you a little bit about why you're here today. So I think you should be seeing that now, and we would love to hear your thoughts on that. So, and we will be doing a couple of polls throughout this based on the discussion, and we'll be making sure we share the results at the end. So now we will hand over to, thank you, Cori, we'll hand over to Dr. Mike Galsworthy, who, as I said at the beginning, is the Director of Scientists for EU and March for Change. And Mike's going to talk to us about NHS data and why big private tech companies might want access to it, and where Mike has seen centralized data go wrong, and an alternative vision for what an alternative vision for NHS data could look like. Thank you for joining us, Mike. Over to you.
Hi, thanks so much for having me on. I mean, health data and large complex health databases are an absolutely fantastic resource, and I've spent my working life on them. I did my degree in genetics, and then I went into health policy and science policy. And so I've been living off big databases around life sciences and health and genetics for since 1998. So a couple of decades until a few years back, where I moved more over into policy advocacy. And the point of big databases in health is that you can do so much beyond your normal academic research. When you look at an issue, you try and study the issue, collect data for it, come to a conclusion, and throw away your data. What we really need to be doing in life sciences is actually having these big databases whereby you can go back, dive in, and find associations between different diseases, find early warning signs. To give an example of what I have done before, is I was on a pan-European project to compare the hospital databases of the UK, Portugal, Spain, Austria, Slovenia, and Denmark, to actually look at how they do some operations, like heart operation or a hip operation, and compare them between the different countries down to a regional level for how long it took the patients to recover, you know, regressing out age and all the rest, how cleanly and with little side effects you can do the operations. And then when you identify who's doing it best, you go and you get them to train up all the others on what makes their particular anesthetic and surgery procedure and recovery procedure better than others. And then you can spread good practice around, which does wonders for efficiency everywhere. And so, as well as taking care of everyone's health through more and more resolution to be able to get down to these details, you're also talking about the efficiencies of systems wholesale. And the more complex databases you've got, and then as you start integrating AI, the more you can do there. And so the potential there, the potential for good, is fantastic. And our NHS is probably the leading database in the world for this, because we are a country of, 68 million people or so that have this system, this database. Well, it's a collection of databases. You've got your GP and your hospitals one and your ICU ones, but basically this vast data resource pretty much standardized for all of the country and in public hands with good record keeping. Often the States, you've got different companies which own clusters of hospitals and they sell out their data to other companies that analyze it. But in the UK, with our NHS, we've got an absolutely fantastic first-rate data resource. And this is what leads now into the government strategy, that the government are fully aware of this, whereas previously their NHS strategy was more about let lots of different companies bid to do bits and pieces of service, and that will make things more efficient. Now they've actually recognized, the value in the data they've got, but their strategy is not to build up centralized public resource so that we understand our own data, but rather it's to say, who around the world can do all of our data analysis for us? Now, with the example, and as Cori was saying before, they've had this intention and they started schmoozing with certain people that they wanted to get involved. But when the pandemic came along, that gave them great cover to just say, we don't need to put things out to tender. We don't need public explanations. We need to move fast. We know people who can do this. If we do this now, we'll be able to save lives. So they pull in those people that they've already developed relationships with and get them into the system. Now, there's a difference between the kind of work that I was doing on that pan-European project and the kind of work a private company does, because we're accountable to the public. We use the data, burn up, we've got no financial interest in it, it's all published and it's all out there. Whereas with companies that have financial interest, what they want to do is less collaborative and more competitive. They want to hog the space, own the space, make money from it, and then hog it and own it more. And that means that there are various risks that come along with this, because their primary concern is not the public interest, but actually rather their own interest. And so there are two big, for me, red flags here that have not been properly addressed in terms of handling big data like this. And one of them is myths around anonymization and the safety associated with it. And the other one, which I've heard hardly anyone talk about, is private algorithms owning our policymaking, or algorithms in private hands being the drivers of our policymaking about health, NHS in this country. So with anonymization, if you were listening in on Dominic Cummings's testimony before the Science and Technology Committee, as I was eagerly, he was asked about Palantir, and he said, "Oh, I'm sure that data has been fully anonymized." And people aren't even using the word anonymized now; they're saying pseudonymized, because anonymized, according to them, means like it's never recoverable, but pseudonymized is. It's all the same thing. It's the concept of, we'll give you a database, and this database, because it's got name taken out, date of birth taken out, you don't know who's who. It's totally fine to muck around with. It's safe. It is not safe. If that database has, for example, postcodes, then I could sit on that database. I could say, well, my postcode is this. I wonder what my neighbors are up to, what their health records are. I know that Bill next door went to hospital 2 weeks ago, and that combination of this postcode, because there's only about 30 people per postcode in the country, and this hospital visit date will quite quickly allow me to find him and find all of his records on it, if I had that, and if I had that intention. To hospital visits, to GP visits, all of these things, your personal data is like a fingerprint, and it's very easy with a little bit of sniffing around to go down the path of re-identification. And so you have to be very, very careful who you're dealing with. Of course, all the contracts say you're not allowed to do this and that, but there are tons of ways that you can get information out of that database and link it across with another that has purposes for insurance, for marketing, for lots of other avenues that we would regard as misuse. And it's very, very difficult to trace who has actually gone and done that once you've handed over databases with single record lines to another entity. And the other thing that I want to say, and I will be quick with this, is that my fear is actually more about the policy control going forward. Imagine the following scenario. Palantir, who are sitting there now, effortlessly gets continued on this contract. Maybe they have been looking at something like obesity in relation to the COVID-19 data store, because that impacts. And they're looking at obesity, and they tip off the government, hey, do you want a big analysis program on obesity in the UK across GP records, hospital records? What are the threats? How do you identify people early? Think of, the cost savings that you can make and the health savings that you can make for the public. And the government goes, oh yeah, that's a good idea. We'll keep working away on that, and we'll put something out to tender, because that's how we have to do things now. And they put something out to tender rapidly. Palantir, jump in with the big proposal. Government, who already work with Palantir, know how wonderful they are, say, wow, this is great, we'll take you on. Palantir are then bunkered in. Palantir have buddies in the States who, guess what, do programs on obesity. Hey, shall we have a little bit of chat about how we can get you into the UK? Yeah, sure, let's do that. And then it comes back that they recommend to the UK, oh, you need this kind of program and that kind of program. We know it's very effective. Another tender goes out, and Palantir, in collaboration with their buddies, get it. And then let's say academics from Oxford and Imperial and the King's Fund come along and say, this looks really dodgy. This looks really sus. We don't think this is the right way to go about tackling obesity. And the government turns around and says, what do you know? You hasn't got the data, man. They've got the data. They've got the algorithms. They've patented the algorithms, so you can't get into them, but they've got really good predictive models, and you don't, because you don't have access to the data. We're ignoring our public advice on this, and we will continue for the foreseeable future to further enrich these corporate companies that can do things better than everyone else, because they are absolutely bunkered into our data set. And that means that everything associated with corruption and control and lack of transparency can go forward without our NHS actually being in our control and in our hands, and in a format whereby we can actually understand properly what's going on. So that is my great fear there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you so much. I think many of us share your great fear, to be honest. Thank you. So we are going to now hear from Clive Lewis MP. Hello, thank you for joining us. Hi, Clive. Just before we pass to Clive, just a reminder that if anyone has any questions that you wanted to ask Mike or Cori or any of the other panelists that are yet to come, please do send those through to Cori. Sorry, don't send them to Cori, send them through to Tom, as you have been doing. Clive Lewis is Labour MP for Norwich South and Vice Chair of the Coronavirus APPG, and we're delighted that you're supporting this campaign, Clive, and we're really interested to hear why you're part of the campaign and a bit more about why you think Palantir isn't a potential partner for the NHS.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. And I think, first of all, a huge thank you to Foxglove for this really timely campaign, which I hadn't heard of you before about a month or two ago, and I'm so glad I have, because you've done some sterling work in this area already, and I'm really excited to be part of your campaign. I listened to Mike with great interest. I'm probably going to go a little bit darker than Mike. That's because I think I want to kind of expand this out to some of the bigger issues, and I'm sure some of the other speakers will touch on that as well. And I think, look, right now, as many of you already know, the government is trying to overhaul the NHS, rewriting the laws which govern it. And a big part of this revamp is a new settlement for the nation's health data. Now, Palantir, as you've already heard, it's a spy tech firm that is set to take into private ownership our most intimate and private health data that we currently entrust to the NHS. Now, if you've ever visited a GP or gone to the hospital or sought help from a healthcare professional through the NHS, then that's your data that's going to be privatised. Now, Palantir, as you already heard, pounced when COVID hit. And they were handed by our own complicit government a no-bid contract to manage the NHS data store. So that's basically a giant database that has everyone's health data in it, as Mike explained. Now, Palantir might seem like a surprising choice of company to entrust with public health services, especially the largest pool of patient data in NHS history. As has already been said, its billionaire chair, Peter Thiel, has spent millions of dollars to elect Donald Trump. It's the CIA's venture capital arm, and was one of its first backers. Palantir tech is used to harm. We've already heard how it's been used on border activities, immigration activities, policing activities. We know it was also used in the Iraq War, in mass surveillance, in predictive policing. And you know what? In February, you may have already heard of this one. Palantir told shareholders it was aiming for Palantir inside every missile, inside of every drone. That sounds like something from RoboCop, one of those mad adverts, to me. I mean, this isn't a company I want involved with the NHS, quite frankly. Now, most of us would, I think, reasonably expect that the purpose of our health records is to provide healthcare practitioners and clinicians with the information that they need to provide us with the right treatment. But Palantir isn't a company that's in the business of doing public good. It's a private company that has the goal of maximizing profit for its shareholders. Your best interest is not in their interest. The privatization of our health data doesn't just raise questions about why the government isn't investing in the NHS's own capacity. It also shines a light on what the next phase of neoliberalism looks like, neo-illiberalism, if you will. That's an emerging model of authoritarian capitalism, where the government is acting in the interests of the private gain of a few at the expense of the public good. Now, personal data is already being harvested and used in any way possible to generate profit for shareholders, whether that's through personalized price discrimination or hyper-nudged political advertising. And data is also increasingly being collected by governments at a local and national level to surveil and control citizens. China's social credit score system, you might have heard of this, is one example of this, where citizens are monitored and punished for behavior the government decides is undesirable. I think it's been made famous by a Dark Mirror episode, or Black Mirror, episode you may have seen. But it's not hard to see what the implications could be if our health data is privatized. Health data, combined with unaccountable algorithmic decision-making, could be used to determine who is and is not allowed to access services. Now, this kind of practice is already being used by some councils, often without consultation or transparency. And such data and algorithms are being used to determine the likes of benefits and social housing claims. Now, further down the line, if that data is sold on to third parties, companies could treat you differently or deny you access to a whole range of services based on your health records. And this will very, very likely entrench existing inequalities. This already happens in the US, where health insurance claims are denied for people with so-called pre-existing conditions. Now, in 2019, the UN Special Rapporteur, Sir Philip Alston, urged against stumbling into what he described as a digital welfare dystopia. And he said that countries were running the risk of becoming Trojan horses for neoliberal hostility towards social protection and regulation. The American political scientist Virginia Eubanks also issued warnings many years ago about the threat of a new digital poorhouse. Her words must stick with us, and I quote, I'm going to read you a quick quote. The most marginalized in our society face higher levels of data collection when they access public benefits, walk through heavily policed neighborhoods, enter the healthcare system or cross national borders, and that data reinforces their marginality when it's used to target them for extra scrutiny. Public ownership, fundamental rights, equality, democracy, and the public services that were foundations of the post-war welfare state. For this government and those whose interests they really represent, such rights are impediments to profit maximization, but also unaccountable power. They are things to be overcome, not to be respected and upheld. That's going to be our job, because our own government, I think that they should be there to protect us, is already on the wrong side of this issue. There is hope. Organizations like Foxglove and Open Democracy are showing the way. And now we must all step up and play our part too. The NHS can come out of this pandemic stronger if we insist on it. The next chapter of the NHS history must be a story about democracy, about using health data for everyone's good, about shoring up a sustainable NHS by paying and supporting staff fairly and keeping faith with the relationship of trust between clinician and patient. But this future is only possible if the public are given a real say over what happens to public institutions. The window of action is now. Earlier this year, Foxglove and Open Democracy forced the government to rethink and talk to people before giving Palantir a long-term NHS role. After an uproar, the Greek government also scrapped a similar health deal with Palantir. We now have to move swiftly and decisively to defend the principle of an NHS that is publicly owned, which everyone can trust. Because as ever, our NHS is on the front line of a fight for the future of not just our health, but also our democracy. So let's get to it. No Palantir in our NHS. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And there are many ways and opportunities that everyone can get involved in this campaign. It isn't just the organisations and their supporters that have signed up. So we'll come on to that towards the end. But thank you so much, Clive. We really appreciate it and appreciate you being here. And as Clive just said, Palantir isn't in the business of doing public good. And I think there are lots of examples of that across the world, and that Clive has talked about and Cori touched on briefly. But particularly Palantir's got a very problematic history of powering US wars and facilitating frankly racist predictive policing and the abuse of migrants worldwide. And Palantir's most controversial, or some of their most controversial contracts, have been with ICE in the US immigration enforcement, and has been used to facilitate deportation raids and arrest family members of unaccompanied child migrants. And so we are very interested to hear from Migrants Rights Network, who are one of the coalition of 52. And we're really interested in hearing your perspective, Katharine, and what concerns you have about Palantir's presence in the NHS and what it means for your network. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon to everybody. We are really delighted at Migrants Rights Network to add our voice and our efforts to this No Palantir campaign. We too are really deeply concerned about the impact of migrant communities that we work with, and the lack of transparency of government action that is setting up bigger and better data sharing, and now with the help of the private sector. And the government has said that its data mining and sharing is part of safeguarding communities that we have little information on. And we agree it would be really naive of us to believe this, and far from the reality of what we know at Migrants Rights Network. In 2018, Migrants Rights Network and Liberty sought to take the Home Office, for example, to court for its memorandum of understanding with the NHS, which allowed patients' data to be shared against patient-doctor confidentiality and against the Human Rights Act. We found that it was putting vulnerable migrants at risk and disproportionately affecting non-white communities who do not have British citizenship. So in practice, the data sharing agreements, once that has been mined and taken by government, and the infrastructure, we saw in this case, forced NHS professionals, and is still forcing them to become border enforcement officers and reporting people that they see. And we're really glad to see the stand of NHS workers in and around East London at the moment against doing this. It is also putting people's health at risk in practice, making those without secure visa statuses fear their own doctors and avoid medical attention. We know of stories from our colleagues at Doctors of the World of women avoiding antenatal care, turning up to hospital in labour without any warning, and cases such as migrant domestic workers who have died, well, one in particular who's died from an undiagnosed persistent cough. In 2018, the UK Parliament Health and Social Care Select Committee called for patient data sharing to stop. It seems like we have a really short-term memory, and this Palantir contract is another lack of transparency and untransparent attempt to set up the infrastructure needed to comprehensively data mine without public awareness, and giving the government the ability to track what happens between government departments, and it doesn't allow us to track when our government departments have such data. I really like Many others and the migrant communities that I work with are really not aware of this opt-out of data sharing before the 23rd of June. So that's a really urgent priority for us now. From those that we know personally who've worked for Palantir and in Palantir and closely with the developers of their data mining and manipulation programs named Gotham and Foundry, they have been used to target migrant communities, for example, as Martha mentioned, as part of the US government's Immigration Control and Enforcement, or ICE program. And this work is kept separate to other Palantir employees' work. We also know that everybody has to sign non-disclosure agreements as part of their contracts, and everyone on these programs, including those on the government and the CIA side, as well as Palantir workers, are all given code names and contracts are agreed well away from the public eye. We also know that Palantir's culture champions innovation ahead of questioning the ethics of what it's being used for. And its extremely comfortable working environment, salaries and benefits really support this. We've also at Migrants' Rights Network been working on other areas of data sharing between government departments once they have the data, which provides an incredibly worrying precedent for how data is and can be shared between the departments. We are, for example, aware of data sharing between the Department of Education and the Home Office, which in 2015 saw 1,500 school children's data shared for immigration enforcement. I am also currently directly working with the highly skilled Tier 1 migrants group. After their visa route was cancelled in 2014, it was mandatory for those wanting to stay in the UK, even after being here for 10 or more years, to fill in an indefinite leave to remain application, which required that they tick a box allowing their data to be accessed. This has seemingly justified a process of data sharing between HMRC and the Home Office without any due process or protections. And we're looking into this to understand it a bit more at the moment. But it's theoretically based on secretive memorandums of understanding signed between the two departments. I have also just found out through a Freedom of Information request that 463,000 people, almost 500,000 people's HMRC data was shared with the Home Office's Visa and Immigration Department between 2015 and 2020, which is a huge amount. So it'll be very interesting to see how that develops with Palantir at the helm now. From this questionable data sharing, and I say that because the immigration exemption used to justify data sharing last week has just been found to be unlawful under GDPR by the Court of Appeal. I found still that 1,700 Tier 1 migrants, highly skilled migrants, were refused indefinite leave to remain for alleged historic tax discrepancies, which are neither a criminal nor an immigration offence. And these were found using mining of their data. So despite a diverse cohort on this visa from countries including the US, Australia and Canada on this visa, I've also found that only non-white people, especially from South Asia and Africa, were refused leave to remain through this HMRC data sharing, and about 70% of the remaining cohort are Muslim. So we see there is a real precedent for effectively reducing the number of migrants from asylum seekers to our Tier 1 visas brightest and best through data sharing. And you can watch some of this information on BBC Two's Newsnight, which has just happened on Tuesday. And I can share the link for that in the chat if that's helpful. So the government's contract with Palantir and others more generally, we are really worried, greatly erodes any sense of security for those without citizenship in the UK. And as a citizen myself, I really want to make sure that people do not have to live in fear of data-backed immigration control that can even cost them their lives by avoiding medical care. So delighted to speak further with anyone about what we're finding at Migrants' Rights Network, and please just message me, and delighted to be with you all this afternoon.
Thank you, Katharine. And if people want to find out more about your work, do you want to share your Twitter handle or website?
Happy to, yeah, of course.
If you put it in the chat, I think everybody should be able to see it. Thank you so much. I am conscious of time and I want to make sure we have time for some questions at the end. So next we're going to hear from Kitty. Kitty is a doctor and is with Docs Not Cops. Docs Not Cops are a campaigning group of NHS professionals and patients who believe health is a right, not a privilege. And Kitty, we're really interested in hearing your perspective as an NHS doctor and how you feel about companies like Palantir playing a role in the NHS, and also why you joined the campaign. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, thank you. I'll try and keep it brief, especially because Katharine outlined so well a lot of the issues around data sharing. But yeah, thanks Martha, and thanks Foxglove for having me. As Martha mentioned, we're a grassroots group fighting racism and borders in healthcare, and we call for an end to the hostile environment in its entirety, but specifically focus on campaigning to end immigration control in all its forms within our NHS. One really important arm of this fight is against data sharing between the NHS and the Home Office for immigration purposes. Katharine's already touched on how devastating data sharing can be, or even just the threat of data sharing. Palantir's hideous track record in assisting with violent racist immigration practice in the US and other forms of mass surveillance and securitization for profit, of course, will only serve to exacerbate the existing devastating impacts of data sharing arrangements in the NHS that are used to violently police our communities. Katharine mentioned some of these, but at present there's several avenues through which data sharing between the NHS and the Home Office is occurring, many of which are deliberately difficult to get information about. One example is that if you are charged for the NHS care you receive and have an outstanding debt of over £500 for more than 2 months, your demographic details are given by your NHS trust to the Home Office. This data can be used to detain and deport you and against you in future visa applications. These practices have had devastating effects for migrants and others racialised as foreign, some of whom are left too scared to access care at all, as we were hearing from Katharine. Research by the New Economics Foundation and MedAct and Migrants Organise during the pandemic added to the body of evidence that exemptions, so for example, care around COVID-19 or the COVID vaccine being free and accessible for all, are completely ineffective. On April the 8th in 2020, we heard of Elvis from the Philippines who died at home with COVID-19 symptoms, too scared to go to the hospital. Even where data sharing has been suspended, for example, between GP practices and the Home Office, we see the really far-reaching effects that last long before, that have lasted long after that suspension, with many people still reluctant even to register with a GP. And I think we need to be really clear, all data sharing arrangements are deliberately designed to work as a deterrent to accessing services. In the case of the hostile environment, they operate just as one barbaric arm of a policy that aims to make life increasingly untenable for some racially minoritized communities, and turns healthcare workers like myself into de facto border guards without our consent. Even if we set aside the really kind of terrifying ways in which private corporations such as Palantir may use our data and look only in the immediate moment, any NHS involvement with Palantir, with its history of collusion with immigration authorities, will of course worsen very legitimate mistrust in the NHS and further reluctance to access health services by those that are already intentionally excluded by our government. And then to finish, I just wanted to turn to a brief reflection on resistance. So at Docs Not Cops, we've got several strands to our work, but core is organising mass resistance of healthcare workers to bordering the NHS from within their workplaces. Policy interventions and legal challenges play a really important role in these campaigns, but we must also be organising mass mobilisation and civil disobedience to collapse arrangements like that with Palantir, and also create awareness, as Foxglove have been doing, about how they link to other issues in the hostile environment and NHS privatisation more broadly, so that we're building cognizant movements who can mobilise quickly against related issues when they occur. To look back briefly to the past, so in the 1980s, when charging in the NHS was first sort of truly enacted, there was a campaign called the No Pass campaign, led by migrants and joined by trade unions and healthcare workers, that quickly forced the government to abandon charging. And it's taken some years for it to re-emerge as we see it today. And then to end, it's been mentioned by a couple of people about NHS Digital's new centralisation of patient data. Katharine again mentioned briefly the GPs of Tower Hamlets, who are doing amazing work at the moment, already organising to collectively refuse to share any of their patients' data, and they're asking GPs across the country to do the same, which is really encouraging and exciting. And I'd urge everyone to kind of have a look at how you opt out personally, but also contact your GP practice if you're registered, and encourage them to collectively withhold that data. And then, yeah, it's fantastic. I'll end there, but it's fantastic to see you all here. And thanks to Foxglove for your absolutely amazing work. Let's get Palantir out of our NHS and fight to ensure our data remains safe for public good, and that we return to a system that's truly free at the point of access for all. Thanks.
Kitty, let's do that, please. Thank you so much for joining us. And will you include a link in the chat to how people, to give more info about how people can hear more about Docs Not Cops? I'm slightly terrified I'll say that the wrong way around. Thank you so much. We are now excitingly going to hear from another doctor. Julia Patterson is the chief executive of Every Doctor, and Every Doctor is a campaigning organisation led by doctors, and they're fighting for a better NHS for patients and doctors. So thank you so much for joining us today, Julia. We've been closely following your cases with Good Law Project challenging NHS privatisation, crony and dodgy PPE contracts. So we're really interested to hear more about why you're part of the campaign and why you think Palantir shouldn't play a role in our NHS. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you so much for having me today. And thank you to all the amazing speakers. It's been fascinating because some of the detail I didn't know as much about. So this has been such a useful session to me as well. I'm not going to repeat things that other people have said because I think so many important points have been made and I don't want to sort of go over old ground. But I suppose we represent doctors, and I suppose their views of their own experiences and the experiences of their patients are at the heart of what we do. So I've got 3 points I would like to make, if that's okay. First of all, you know, the NHS is a public health service. That seems to have been lost in many policy decisions in recent years. Something we're focusing on an awful lot at the moment is NHS privatisation, which comes to the centre of so many of the problems which are happening within the NHS at the moment. We feel that as a whole country, we need to get back to this idea that we're aiming to offer a proper public health service which offers people free treatment, whoever you are, whatever your background. We're going to do so in a way that feels safe to you and maintain confidentiality between clinicians and patients. And whether people's concern about their data is a real risk or a perceived risk, it could throw up barriers for patients to feel that their data is going to be shared. I suspect not many people understand what's going on at the moment. I suspect that if things move forward and become more complex, there will still be a proportion of the public who won't fully understand what's going on, and not everybody understands what data sharing involves. And you know, there is a lot of sensitive data sharing that goes on between clinicians and patients every single day, and we don't want that being harmed in any way at all. So we feel very strongly, extremely strongly, that if this is to be entertained as a long-term policy decision regarding the NHS, then there needs to be public consultation, and there needs to be an awful lot of sharing of awareness, and so far that's really been minimal. I mean, I would imagine that the minority of people understand this is happening. And secondly, I think doctors, the experiences that we hear from the members that we have is that they worry about how data sharing could impact on consultations and the information that we glean from patients, which allows us to diagnose patients properly. For example, let's say you're running up a sexual health clinic. If somebody feels their data might be shared, there's lots of very difficult conversations which take place between clinicians and patients that allow them to be treated safely. We worry that could be impacted. And I suppose thirdly, it's the broad conversation about the value of data in our society. And as our society goes forward, we all know now that the data from humans is the most valuable commodity in our society, and it's being exploited in many ways that other people have already articulated. But if there is to be profit generated in this way, if the public does decide this is what they want to happen with NHS data, then surely the conversation should involve that profit being put back into the NHS, which is underfunded, has been underfunded for many years now, and the service is failing. Now, I'm going to sort of add on to that we don't agree with the data being profit generating with this particular company, or indeed any private company in this way. But for example, if data could be profit generating in a way that increased health equalities around the world, then that is a conversation that perhaps could be entertained, and there may be money generated from working with other countries with pharmaceuticals, I don't know, but certainly if any profit is going to be generated in a positive way with companies that the public decide they're happy to work with the NHS, then that money needs to come back to the NHS, because we are woefully underfunded, the staff are underpaid, patients aren't getting a good enough service. And so this is such a broad conversation. It doesn't just come down to Palantir at all, although of course the pandemic has accelerated their involvement in the NHS. So I'm going to stop there, but thank you so much.
Julia, thank you very much. Thanks so much for joining us. So our final speaker today is Gracie Bradley. Gracie is the Interim Executive Director of Liberty, and many of you probably know who Liberty are already because they're so awesome, but Liberty is the UK's largest civil liberties organisation, and they work on a huge range of issues, not just those that we're talking about today, but including policing, migrant rights issues, privacy and mass surveillance. And so, Gracie, we're really pleased to have you. And we'd love to hear more about your work and why Liberty is part of this campaign and what you think that the public can be doing. We as a group of people pushing forward this campaign can do to preserve our NHS and ensure that companies like Palantir aren't allowed in the back door.
Thanks, Martha, and thanks, Foxglove, not just for having me, but also for leading this work and for all of the brilliant work that you do. And it's really great to be able to join everybody this evening. As Martha said, I'm here from Liberty. We were founded in 1934 in response to oppressive policing of the hunger marches, but state and private surveillance has been a key part of our work for decades. And I seem to run into a lot of people who have been part of Liberty for, since before I was born. So there may be some people who remember Liberty, buying some private personal records that had been put up for sale, and we bought them for £1 and then we destroyed them because we thought actually nobody should be profiting from this. So this is really part of our DNA. I mean, when I was working on the last data protection bill in 2017, I was going through old briefings. I found our briefings from the 1980s. So this is really our bread and butter. And it's just really great to have so many allies in this fight now. The scene is very different from how it was years and years ago. And look, we've covered what's wrong with Palantir. At Liberty, we have a particular concern around the fact that this is a company that has been accused of complicity with gross human rights violations against a range of minoritized groups. And it's a real worry that it has gained a foothold in the NHS that, if it's not opposed, could become permanent. And of course, this is happening at the same time as a generic kind of rise in the surveillance state, but also at the same time as the government increasingly turns to new technologies to kind of restrict and interfere with the rights of particular marginalized groups. And this has really been the bread and butter of my work at Liberty. I've been at Liberty for the last 4 years, and I've been leading work at the intersection of kind of data protection, immigration enforcement, counter-terror and policing. And this issue is where all of those kind of nightmare things collide, unfortunately. And we've spoken a lot about what happens, the way the hostile environment has been digitized. In 2016, that was what brought me into campaigning the use of children's school records for immigration enforcement. And I think what we've seen with the hostile environment is that it is an attempt to reach data from every part of people's lives. So as Katharine has said, we're talking about health, education, policing, homelessness, banks, the DWP, HMRC, the DVLA. There is sharing between all of those agencies and the Home Office for immigration enforcement purposes and for entitlement checks. And so I think what we've seen with the hostile environment is this kind of terrible case study in the government assigning people some kind of suspect status and then sharing data with other agencies to interfere with their rights on that basis, either to advance a kind of state agenda that might interfere with their rights. So that might be immigration enforcement, which interferes with people's rights, or policing, or counter-terror. All of these things interfere with people's rights, or potentially to shut them out of essential services. We see it going both ways. So the hostile environment, I think people have a good understanding of how that works. And, Liberty's has been working with lots of organizations on that for a number of years. But it's really important to be clear that this is what's happening with all of the coercive edges of state power. So this is what's happening in counter-terror. People are being assigned that status of domestic extremist or whatever, vulnerable to radicalization. And then we're seeing that data sharing happening and those interferences with their rights. That's also what's happening in policing. So you may have seen the most recent policing bill that aims to establish serious violence reduction orders, which again mandate sharing between the police and other agencies. And the police are in charge. The other agencies are not in charge, and they have to share data essentially when they're mandated to by the police. And what all of this does is it has an enormous deterrent effect on people coming to services that might otherwise support or protect them. So if you're potentially at risk of being victim to some kind of violence or committing some kind of violence, it's actually deeply counterproductive to make you scared to speak to your doctor about what's happening to you, or your teacher, or your housing officer. And yet that is what's happening. And I think it's important to be clear that these processes are really racialized, right? Those labels of gang nominal or undocumented migrant or potential extremist, they're all really racialized. This isn't something that's happening equally. But at the same time, we need to be really clear that these systems of control are not going to be confined to these suspect groups. So we've touched on that immigration exemption in the Data Protection Act 2018. And I think it's really important for us to know that the way that exemption is drafted, it is not confined to migrants, right? It's confined by purpose. So if the data is processed for the purpose of immigration control, anybody can have their data protection rights set aside. So if we're thinking, oh, well, we need to check everyone's status to make sure somebody isn't going to the doctor when they're not entitled to, right? What you essentially have is a kind of hook for creating a kind of digital ID system that sets aside everybody's rights in the name of immigration control or gangs policing or counter-terror, right? That's what's happening here. So that's the shape of the state where we are. And of course, there are the more general issues in terms of how the state aims to use new technologies to govern us, the rise of facial recognition, predictive analytics. So we're moving into a space where it will be easier and easier for the state to know what we're doing, who we're with, and intervene in our lives on that basis, and also to profile us and intervene in our lives based on the fact that we fit a class of other people that it thinks that we're like. And I think if we think about what we've seen in the pandemic, which is kind of handing the police loads of powers, lots of coercive stuff, but not the stuff that would have supported people to comply with public health advice, you know, like proper sick pay or places to isolate that aren't your home. I think it's fair to say that we should be worried that these state interventions are not going to they're not going to enhance people's rights protections. So that's the doom and gloom bit. That's my analysis. In terms of what we can do, I think I want to, you know, I've been working at Liberty on this issue of government use of data for immigration enforcement for the last 4 years or so. And it's really important to be clear that we have had wins. You know, 200,000 children and parents boycotted the school census in solidarity with migrant children and families. And that data collection from the census has stopped. We've seen some health data sharing stop in response to parliamentary lobbying and litigation. We've seen, you know, when I joined Liberty, the Greater London Authority had created a map of rough sleepers, migrant rough sleepers, to help the Home Office and partners do enforcement against them. The GLA is now a great champion of, actually, we need a firewall and we're not going to have our homelessness services intervene in immigration enforcement in this way. They've pulled that service. So it's hard work, but we can win concessions. And I suppose what I would want to say by way of conclusion is that it's really easy when things are not great to be defensive constantly. And so to always be trying to maintain the status quo. And I think we need to remember that actually for a lot of people, the status quo doesn't work. It's not very good. So for all that we want to say no Palantir, I think it's really important that we also figure out together, what do we want? What do we want to go for? How do we bring that into being? So yes, let's do the kind of multidisciplinary campaigning and the mass mobilizations against this, but let's not lose sight of the world that we want to be in. And I'll leave it there. And I also have to leave. So thanks a lot for having me, and farewell.
Oh, thank you, Gracie. We really appreciate you joining us. I'm conscious that we're running out of time, but I just wanted to say thanks so much to everyone for all of the amazing questions that are in the chat. I think we can only answer one now, and I'm going to ask Clive to answer that in a second, if that's okay. But some of the questions that have been coming up that I can quickly answer, lots of people have asked about how people people can opt out of the GP data issue that lots of people have been talking about today, and we'll make sure to share in the chat a useful guide by our friends at Med Confidential, who have some clear and good information about how you can do that. And the other question is, will this be posted after the event? Yes, it absolutely will. We will make sure it's uploaded tomorrow. So the one question that we do have time for, I think, before we close out, and I promise we will do something to answer all of the other questions that we've received, is from Bernard, who asks Clive, how many MPs are aware of the issue, and do you know of any others that are supporting the campaign or actively speaking out about concerns to do with companies like Palantir and their role in the NHS?
No, is the short answer. I was hoping you might be able to tell me of a list of MPs that have replied and responded to your campaign. I imagine that you will find that some of them come on board. I mean, look, there will be MPs that across all the political parties that will take great issue on this from a privacy perspective. And that would include people like David Davis and others who will probably end up jumping up and down about this in some way. I might not like everything they're saying about this, but in some elements of it. So it's about building those coalitions. But I imagine there will be quite a few people inside the campaign group and beyond who would also be quite concerned about this from a traditional perspective about unaccountable big corporations having control, increasing control and access to a resource, a public resource, and our privacy, our data. So Mike is waving his finger. He might actually know a little bit more. But I imagine some of those names will start coming out of the woodwork now, hopefully.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, so before we hear some amazing music from Jenny Cleaver, who I can see getting ready and I'm very excited about, just to say that there are lots of where this campaign is just the launch of the campaign, and there's lots more to come and to be done, and we are really excited to work with all of the coalition that have signed up to be part of this campaign, but also all of the people that are here today and more. So thanks so much for being part of it. There are two things that you can do. One is follow all of the amazing organisations who've spoken today and who are part of the coalition. And two is if you go to the website for the campaign, which is nopalantir.org.uk, you can sign the petition, which Cori mentioned earlier, and we can't wait to have you as part of the campaign and to work together on these issues moving forward. So before I hand over to Jelly, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to all of the speakers today and everyone for taking part. We really appreciate it and are looking forward to working with you moving forward. So Jelly, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, and I really appreciate being on this kind of panel with such amazing speakers and for such an incredible cause. So yeah, shout out to everybody who's organised this. And I'm just going to do a couple of songs which I think kind of tie into the themes that you've been talking about. So this first song I wrote, I actually wrote it just at the beginning of the pandemic, so I think in March, just when, it looked like everything was kind of going downhill, but, the important message was that we will get through it together. And I think, the NHS just embodies that, collective spirit, and that we also need to be there for them and to support them after they've done so incredibly. So this song is called Whatever Pain May Come. In these times of us, when uncertainty steals your breath and worry aches your bones, know that you're not alone. Though I can't hold you close, I still love you the most, and I'll see you again just as soon as I can. 'Cause if there's one thing I know, I know that we are going to get through this together, whatever pain may come. I know that we are going to get through this together, whatever pain may come. Together, whatever pain may come, darling, I know our love is stronger than whatever pain may come, whatever pain may come, whatever pain may come, whatever pain may come, whatever pain may come. And can you think how good it will be? Just think how good it will be. Can you think how good it will be? Just think how good it will be. Oh, think how good it will be. Just think how good it will be. Oh, can you think how good it will be when it's all over? Because I know that we are going to get through this together, whatever pain may come. I know that we are going to get through this together, whatever pain may come. Together, whatever pain may come, darling, I know our love is stronger than whatever pain may come, whatever pain may come, whatever pain may come, whatever pain may come, whatever pain may come. Thank you. And I'm just going to finish with one more tune. This is a song that I kind of wrote and produced after going to protests around what was happening to the Windrush generation, and I kind of sampled some of the incredible speeches and made that into a piece of music, which I'm going to play for you now. So I hope you enjoy this. It's called Windrush.
Of justice, and we shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome.
When the wind rushes through the trees, hey now, oh, is she sighing, or is she bringing a change? When the wind rushes through the trees, hey now, oh, is she sighing, or is she bringing a change? When the tide breaks upon the sea,
now. You both find shelter or be blown away. Rushes through the trees. Hey now, hey now. There she's sighing. Why is she bringing the change? So we are going to rise, we're going to rise. So we are going to rise, we're going to rise. So we are going to rise, we're going to rise. And we shall overcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for having me to perform.
Thank you, Jelly. You were amazing. Okay, bye everyone. Thanks so much. Cori, unless you want to say anything to close us out. No? Otherwise.
Thanks everyone for coming. You see the links in the chat to find out more. Onward and
Thanks for
upward.
having
Thank
us.
you everyone for came. Thanks everyone.
And thanks for the music. I love that.
Gorgeous. Solid.
So good.
More soon, everyone. Bye.